The old photograph of Lennox Castle first surfaced in an auction lot of unclassified estate papers, bundled between water-damaged ledgers and unrelated family correspondence. The archivist who found it described the image as accidentally deliberate, as if someone had meant for it to be seen only decades after the building's final breath. At first glance, it was just another record of a Scottish mansion undergoing transition in the mid-1930s. But the longer one studied the frame, the more it resisted simplicity. The castle's dark sandstone walls stood like a monument to a vanished aristocracy, yet the photograph felt strangely clinical, too still, too watchful, as though the building itself were waiting to be questioned. The Lennox mansion had once been a symbol of ambition in the Scottish countryside, built in the 1830s when families of means sought to display lineage through architecture. But by 1936, as policies surrounding mental health shifted and overcrowded institutions scrambled for new facilities, the mansion was purchased and repurposed into a psychiatric asylum. That transformation left scars barely visible to the eye, and the photograph captured the moment those scars began to form. Two orderlies stood foregrounded in their wool coats, tools of their new profession resting in a handcart. Behind them, the facade loomed, windows half-boarded, renovations incomplete, ivy clinging like an old habit resisting change. Yet nothing in that tableau puzzled researchers as much as the figure at the right edge of the frame. The small, thin silhouette wore what resembled an institutional gown, an anachronism, given that patients were not supposed to occupy the grounds until the renovation's final stage. Even stranger was the pale hand gripping the inside of the doorway arch behind the figure. There was no visible body attached to it, no shadow indicating someone retreating from sight. A hand alone, motionless, while the rest of the photograph showed the telltale blur of a long exposure. This was the detail that halted the archivist mid-page, the detail that made the image impossible to ignore. Initial theories circled quickly. Some speculated the hand belonged to a worker, stepping aside just as the shutter opened. Others proposed a photographic defect or accidental double exposure. But none of these explanations aligned with the clarity of the hand's shape, the tension in its fingers, or the angle at which it clung to the stone, as if bracing itself. Even the position behind the figure suggested a spatial inconsistency. Nothing about it felt incidental. The more the photograph was examined, the more questions surfaced. Who took it, and for what purpose? Why was a patient-like figure present before the asylum officially opened? And why did no surviving renovation records mention the presence of early transfers or provisional housing during that period? These inconsistencies hinted at a narrative buried beneath administrative silence. Then came the first dramatic shift. A historian reviewing property ledgers from the era noted that the date penciled on the back of the photograph did not match the documented renovation schedule. The image might have been taken earlier or later than claimed, meaning the presence of the mysterious figure and the unexplained hand could challenge the official timeline of the asylum's establishment. This discrepancy fractured the most accepted interpretation of the image and invited a deeper investigation into what Lennox Castle was hiding at the threshold of its transformation. And so the central question emerged. Was this photograph simply a misdated artifact, or was it a suppressed record of something the institution never intended to acknowledge? The investigation into the photograph began with a technical analysis, the kind typically reserved for disputed historical documents. A photographic specialist from the University of Edinburgh examined the grain structure, exposure length, and chemical residue on the paper stock. Her conclusion was unsettling. The image was printed on a type of gelatin silver paper that did not enter Scottish commercial circulation until late 1937. That meant the photograph could not have been taken during the year marked on its reverse. Either the date had been intentionally altered, or someone had attempted to obscure when the image was truly captured. This single contradiction opened a crack in the narrative, suggesting that the asylum's early years were far less orderly than the official reports implied. Digging into archival records from the Stirlingshire Health Board only deepened the mystery. Renovation files described a meticulously controlled conversion process, with strict instructions that no patients were to be transferred to the grounds until the final safety inspections were complete. Yet several entries in staffing rosters from the same period quietly referenced temporary attendants assigned to unnamed duties in the castle's lower floors. These references ended abruptly, with no accompanying personnel files. When researchers requested access to the employment logs, they found them partially destroyed by a documented storage incident decades earlier, a fire that consumed only one set of records, and conveniently, one relating to the asylum's transition years. Former staff or their descendants were sought out to fill the gaps. One elderly man, the son of a night attendant, recalled his father mentioning early guests, an odd euphemism for individuals moved into the estate before official approval. The man described hearing about a group housed in makeshift quarters while the upper floors were still being rewired. When shown the photograph, he paused at the figure standing near the column. "The gowns weren't issued until later," he murmured, tracing the silhouette with his fingertip. "Whoever that is, they shouldn't have been there at the time." His testimony contradicted every administrative statement on record. Attention then shifted to the hand in the archway. Forensic analysis confirmed it was not a photographic glitch. The light fell across the knuckles with too much precision. The hand belonged to someone standing deeper inside the doorway, positioned at an angle inconsistent with the figure in the gown. But the doorway, according to architectural diagrams from the renovation, had been sealed from the interior during electrical work. Anyone inside during that stage would have been trapped in a corridor with no documented access. As the investigation progressed, a critical discovery emerged from a retired historian who had quietly collected forgotten documents relating to Scottish institutional reform. Among her files was an unindexed memorandum from early 1938, referencing the transfer of 5 preliminary cases deemed unsuitable for existing facilities. No names were given, merely initials, yet the memorandum noted that these individuals were kept under restricted observation due to behavioral unpredictability. The location of their temporary placement was blacked out in thick ink, but the spacing on the page aligned perfectly with the word Lennox. This revelation ignited a new hypothesis. The photograph might have captured one of those preliminary cases, an early patient housed before Lennox Castle was legally authorized to operate. If true, it would explain the gown, the secrecy, and perhaps the presence of the figure behind the doorway. But there was still no record of who supervised these individuals or what ultimately happened to them. Just as the team prepared to accept this trail as the fullest extent of available evidence, another anomaly surfaced. A glass negative, mislabeled and stored with unrelated hospital materials, depicted the same portion of the castle facade, but with a faint shape in the archway where the hand appeared in the photograph. This earlier image lacked clarity, yet it hinted that the doorway might have been a point of activity long before the asylum officially opened. Someone, or several people, had been there. This discovery set the investigation on a sharper, more urgent course. The mysterious hand was not an isolated artifact. It was the last trace of a story the institution had worked, deliberately or not, to erase. The breakthrough came when a preservation team examining the castle's remaining basement corridors uncovered a metal lockbox embedded in a wall cavity, sealed behind plaster consistent with renovations from the late 1930s. Inside were records unlike anything found in official archives: fragmented patient notes, unsigned observation sheets, and a small ledger marked only with the initials PCU. The historian accompanying the team recognized the abbreviation immediately: Pre-Certification Unit, an unofficial holding category used briefly in Scotland before formal mental health legislation standardized admission procedures. These units were rarely acknowledged, even in internal documents, because they allowed authorities to house individuals without formal legal oversight. Lennox Castle, it appeared, had served as one of those covert locations. The ledger's entries were sparse but chilling. 5 individuals, initials only, were transferred to the estate before safety inspections were complete. Their living quarters were described as temporary and restricted, situated in lower-level rooms intended for storage rather than habitation. The entries ended abruptly after only 3 weeks, with a single line: "Movement discontinued due to incident in East Wing." No explanation followed, no signatures, no subsequent references. Archivists had long suspected that Lennox Castle's early years were chaotic, but nothing hinted at secret admissions under conditions that bypassed legal requirements. Now, the photograph's oddities began to align with something larger and more deliberate. Attention turned to the figure in the institutional gown. Using height, posture, and proportional analysis, specialists determined the figure was likely younger than previously assumed, possibly an adolescent or young adult. One of the initials in the ledger, EC, corresponded to an age designation noted only as youth. The ledger also included a remark that this individual exhibited withdrawn behavior and avoidance of group transfer. The figure in the photograph stood apart, half hidden, mirroring exactly that description. But it was the next discovery that irrevocably shifted the course of the investigation. A faded annotation in the margin of an observation sheet, written in a hurried hand. Repeated attempts to access sealed corridor, claims someone waits inside. The sealed corridor was identified in architectural diagrams as the very location where the pale hand appeared in the photograph. When structural historians recreated the spatial layout, they noted that the corridor had been bricked off during the earliest phase of renovations, leaving a narrow interior space accessible only through a small maintenance hatch. If someone had been inside, they would have had almost no light, no ventilation, and no sanctioned reason to be there. The idea seemed impossible until the team examined the second photograph, the misfiled glass negative. In that earlier image, the archway indeed held a faint silhouette, not a trick of exposure, but a human shape, partially obscured by dust and age. The outline suggested someone standing inside the very corridor, sealed to the outside world. As these findings converged, a retired psychiatric nurse from a nearby district came forward unexpectedly. She had heard of the renewed interest in Lennox and claimed that years ago she was told stories by older staff about the ones who were there before the doors opened. She described whispered accounts of a youth who refused to leave a particular wing, insisting a companion had been separated from him during transit. When the wing was sealed, the youth's agitation allegedly grew severe, prompting attendants to confine him to a lower floor. No documentation supported her claims, but her description aligned uncannily with the ledger's entries and with the demeanor of the figure captured in the photograph. Forensic review of the hand's position added another layer. Analysts noted the fingers were splayed in a posture suggesting distress, not support, as though the person behind the archway was pressing against the stone from within. The hand's angle indicated the individual was facing outward, toward the camera, not retreating. And because the photograph captured it in perfect clarity despite a long exposure, the hand must have remained unnaturally still, frozen in place, long enough for the camera to register its presence. The final revelation came from a nearly illegible line in the lockbox ledger, written so lightly it was almost unnoticeable. Under the entry for EC, someone had added, "Last seen attempting communication at East Arch." The date matched the estimated time frame of the photograph. Suddenly, everything reassembled into a coherent, devastating truth. The photograph had not captured a renovation oversight or a stray worker. It had captured the last recorded moment of two individuals, one visible in the gown, the other reduced to a single hand, attempting to reconnect through a sealed passage designed to contain them. The mystery was no longer about a misplaced date or an unexplained shadow. It was about the silent erasure of vulnerable people whose presence the institution never intended to acknowledge. In the aftermath of the discovery, the ruins of Lennox Castle took on an entirely different weight. What had once been dismissed as mere deterioration, the collapsed stairwells, the scorched door frames, the warped floorboards, now felt like the residue of a story that had never been permitted to surface. Researchers walked through the empty corridors with a new sense of unease, recognizing that the structure's silence had been curated, not accidental. Every missing file, every vague administrative reference, every destroyed ledger pointed toward an institutional decision to let memory decay alongside the building itself. And yet, the photograph had survived, carrying within its grain a truth that resisted burial. The lockbox files were submitted for preservation and review, sparking immediate debate among historians and public health scholars. Some argued that the documents were inconclusive, lacking names, confirmations, or direct corroboration. Others insisted the context was too precise to dismiss. The figure in the gown, the sealed corridor, the ledger's marginalia, all aligned to form a pattern of covert early admissions that violated both ethical standards and legal requirements of the time. The hand pressing outward from behind the archway became an emblem of everything the institution had once suppressed. The presence of individuals rendered invisible not by malice alone, but by an administrative system that prioritized order over humanity. As descendants of former staff learned of the findings, reactions were complicated. A few expressed disbelief, insisting their relatives were devoted caretakers who followed protocol. Others admitted that rumors had long circulated within families, rumors of early transfers, of temporary placements justified by overcrowding elsewhere, of young patients moved without documentation to avoid public scrutiny. One woman recounted hearing her grandmother describe listeners behind the walls, people who were told they would remain only briefly but stayed longer than anyone planned. Her account echoed, almost word for word, the annotation in the ledger about individuals attempting communication through sealed passages. The ruins themselves offered one final clue. During a structural survey of the East Wing, long considered too unstable to enter, engineers uncovered the remnants of the sealed corridor referenced in the photograph. The interior was smaller than expected, a narrow stone vault, no longer than a short hallway. Yet markings on the interior walls revealed repeated scratching and abrasions at shoulder height, as though someone had pressed or clawed against the surface over a sustained period. No human remains were found, no conclusive trace of what happened inside. But the physical evidence mirrored the position of the hand in the photograph with painful accuracy. Whoever had been trapped inside had tried to be seen. Confronted with this proof, the investigative team assembled a provisional timeline. The youth in the gown, likely EC from the ledger, had attempted to reach someone behind the sealed wall. The other figure, whose hand appeared in the photograph, may have been one of the unnamed transfers housed during the chaotic early months of the Asylum's operation. Their separation, possibly accidental or the result of a procedural mistake, was never corrected. The incident in the East Wing recorded in the ledger may have referred not to an accident, but to the institutional decision to end efforts to retrieve those trapped inside. And because the photograph surfaced decades later without explanation, it was likely taken by someone who recognized the gravity of the moment, but lacked the authority to intervene. What became of E.C. remains uncertain. No subsequent entries recorded the youth's fate, and no surviving colleagues could confirm what happened after the East Wing incident. Some speculated the youth was transferred to another facility under a different file number. Others believed he remained in Lennox until his death, lost among the thousands who passed through the institution's doors in the decades that followed. The hand behind the archway, however, vanished entirely from institutional memory. It would take the photograph, an unassuming artifact mislabeled and nearly forgotten, to restore even this sliver of recognition. As the documentary returns to the present, the camera lingers on the decaying facade of Lennox Castle. Wind moves through the hollow windows, carrying the faint echoes of lives once contained within its walls. The mystery is not fully resolved. Fragments remain missing, and some truths may never be recovered. Yet the photograph stands as a rare testament to what institutions tried to obscure. Individuals caught in the margins, preserved by accident rather than intention. In acknowledging their presence, even without the completion of their stories, the ruins gain meaning beyond abandonment. They become a memorial, not to the castle's grandeur, but to the lives that slipped between the official lines, leaving only a hand in the doorway to mark their existence.